I am thrilled to welcome back our good friend, Nathan Brown from Trailhead Design Co. What's up, Nathan?
Hey, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm doing really good. Really excited to be here and do some painting.
As always, I'm loving your backdrop, by the way. I know you're a huge comic book lover. I think that kind of shows.
I am super nerdy.
So what are you going to be showing the Design Cuts community today, Nathan?
We're going to be walking through a mixed media painting. It's a portrait painting, and I'm going to be trying to use as much different media as I can from the Ultimate Brush Toolbox. And we're just going to walk through it and look at it layer by layer and talk about how I use some of the different media to build up a super cool loose portrait.
Incredible. I'm really excited. Shall we get into it? And as you just mentioned, you're going to actually be demoing the Ultimate Brush Toolbox. And
yes, for sure.
Yeah, my exact wording to you, I think before we went live, is this is hands down the greatest brush pack I've ever seen in my entire life. So I genuinely mean that. It's incredible. We're going to show that in more detail for people. But for now, shall we jump in?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
Let me share my screen real quick. You can see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay. Cool. And you can still see me too, correct?
Yeah. You're very small down the bottom with me.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of the brushes, and then we're going to jump into the painting itself. But the brush toolbox, it includes everything that you see from the pencils here all the way down to the textures here. So there's 12 separate sets that equal about 300 brushes for Procreate, Photoshop, Illustrator, Affinity Photo, and Affinity Designer, and I believe that covered, and Procreate. So that's a total of, for 5 apps, that's 1,500 brushes in this pack.
That is literally 1,500 brushes from
Correct.
Nathan, who is, one of the foremost brush creators in the world. This pack is so ridiculous. Again, we're going to show it in a bit more detail later.
It was 5 months in the making, and it was my background is in traditional media, so I tried my best to bridge the gap between, or the gap that I saw between, like your typical digital brushes versus real media. So I tried to capture the feel and the texture as much as possible in each brush set. And I have experience with all of these media, so I tried my best to make it where the experience, if you're painting, if you're using charcoal on the screen, it feels and looks as much like charcoal on paper as I felt possible. And I try to do that with each of these. So each set contains so much, and I could talk for just on the set by itself for a couple of hours, but I'm just I'm gonna try to jump into it as quickly as I can. But we're gonna start these. What we're gonna use today in this painting is these top sets, which is pencil, watercolor, gouache, oil, acrylic, and we're gonna talk a little bit about the airbrush set. Now, what got me the most excited about doing this brush set was the possibility of mixed media. And early on, when I was conceptualizing all of these brushes, I immediately thought about a mentor of mine, or an influence of mine that I've had for a long time. That he's a mixed media artist, and you may not know his name, but you certainly know his work. And it's Drew Struzan. And if you went to the movies in the 80s, or you've seen a movie from the 80s, chances are Drew Struzan illustrated the movie poster. And early on, I'm talking maybe 10, 15 years ago, I would just pore over his poster illustrations, and I would try to figure out what he did and how he did it. And I'd kind of come to this conclusion that it was just beyond my ability to understand the magic of what he was doing. Until a few years ago. For one, I was at a comic book convention, because that's my jam, and there was a booth set up, and there was a representative of Drew Struzan there, and he had all of these fine quality prints that they were huge. They were the movie poster size, like 27 by 40 prints. And I could see really up close what was going on and the textures and everything. And I said,
Did you get them?
Well, I did buy a couple. I bought an autographed ET poster.
Nice.
As you do. And, I asked the guy there, I said, is this acrylic and colored pencil? And he said, yeah, it is. And I thought, what? He's using colored pencil over acrylic? That's, in my mind, an acrylic painting was an acrylic painting and you didn't do anything else, or a watercolor was watercolor and you didn't add anything to it. But now I care more about the end result than I do staying within the rules of a watercolor must be a watercolor. Now, I know there's some traditionalists who would agree that, watercolor must be a watercolor, but I'm more concerned with the end result. And he put out a video, Drew Struzan put out a video a few years ago on his process. And that really changed my life, because seeing him walk through combining all these different media together, it was just eye-opening. And I thought, oh man, just all the possibilities. So I tried to capture the limitless possibilities of mixed media in this brush set. Now, in traditional, there's a few things like chemically that you can't do. You can't paint watercolor over oil paint, or charcoal over oil paint. It would never dry. But in digital, there's literally no rules. I mean, you can paint oil paint over charcoal or marker over charcoal. It doesn't matter. There's no rules. So I thought, man, the possibilities, it's endless. Okay. So
I love that. And Nathan, I'm such a huge fan of mixed media.
Yes.
Way back at school in art class, I would always try and experiment with different medias. It's so much more fun. And you're right, it leads to some really interesting results.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So for this painting, I like painting these lately. I like painting these crusty bearded guys that look like they've been lost at sea. Just their faces are so interesting, and the beards are crazy, and their hair and just their eyebrow, just these crusty looking guys. So I thought it would make a real interesting subject for this particular painting. And I had done a similar painting for the watercolor demo for the Ultimate Brush Toolbox. So I thought this would be a really nice subject matter for this particular painting. So these are my reference photos. Really interesting beards and hair and everything that we need. So from that reference, I did an initial pencil sketch. Okay. So now there was a couple of questions about, I think it was proportions and lighting. Is that right?
Yeah, that is.
Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about proportions then. So in a portrait, and especially if you have a reference photo, and maybe you've got a collection of reference photos, and you've got them next to your drawing, and you can kind of study the proportions of the face. There's a few things to note, just because proportions of the face, you can vary them. There's a standard that you can start from, but everyone's face is different, so you don't have to necessarily stick to the same proportions all the time. But this is kind of a roadmap to work from. But for example, for the eyes, if you were to draw, there's the eye line, and then there's the brow line. Okay. Usually those are right about there. If this is his head, right here, it's kind of a little more than halfway. Okay. If this is his chin. Okay. The ears are usually even, the top of the ears, usually even with the brow line. Okay. And the eyes, the eye line is divided into thirds. 1, 2, 3. The space in between the nose is usually about equal to the width of the eye. Okay. Also, this line can be brought down to about where the nostrils are. Okay. And then the corners of his mouth, it's covered up by his mustache, but let's just say the corners of his mouth, if you could see them, it's usually about even with the pupils in the eye. And then the bottom of the ear is usually about even with the bottom of the nose. Does that make sense?
That's super helpful. Yeah.
And then there's a center line that runs down to kind of help you with the layout. Now that's just kind of a rough roadmap. Now you can also divide the head 1, 2, 3, meaning the hairline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
1, 2, 3. Lots of divisions into thirds. That's a basic roadmap for proportions and general layout. And that's usually what I go by. But again, depending on the face, the nose could be a little wider, the mouth could be a little smaller, the eyes may be a little further apart, just things that you might vary a little bit. But if you know these things, it makes those variations really easy to place.
And I guess it's like learn the rules before you break them. So try and get this down, and then you can start playing with the facial characteristics.
Exactly. Like if you know generally where everything is, it makes it a lot easier to make adjustments and move things around. Okay, so now let's see what we can do here. Okay, now this is my refined sketch. Okay, so I went from this initial sketch and I just went in and I refined with some pencil. I also set a really helpful tip because I did some color variation. If you set alpha lock, it's just when you click on the thumbnail and you choose alpha lock on Procreate, and you color, you're only coloring the lines that it's like a layer mask.
Yep.
So then you can color. That's how I colored these different. I colored his beard and hair different from his skin. Now there was another question about was it light and shadow?
Yes.
Okay. Let's take a new layer here. I'm going to move it down. I'm almost out of layers in this, so I have a limited. This is a really big canvas, so I'm limited with the layers. Okay. Now, light and shadow, it helps to know the planes of the face. When I say planes of the face, it's kind of like knowing that this is a direction and this is a direction. Okay, this is a plane, this is a plane, this is a plane. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Can you see that? Okay.
Yeah, so you're thinking in 3D, not 2D.
Exactly. This is a plane, this is a plane. Okay. This is a plane, this is a plane. If we could see his chin, there would be a plane here where it comes. It's going to be kind of hard to show because it's directly at us, but there would be a plane here coming out and then going in for his chin. So light would hit here, but then this would be in shadow. Okay. Light would hit here and then it might hit here, but his upper lip, if we could see his upper lip because it's disguised under his gnarly mustache, but then so this would be in shadow. This would be a plane here. It would be in shadow, but then light would hit here. Okay. This would be in shadow under here. Light would hit here. And this would be in shadow under here. So knowing these planes helps you to determine light and shadow. So if our light, it looks like for this one, our light is kind of coming maybe from this direction, right? So it's hitting his forehead. And then there's a little bit of shadow here. There's definitely shadow here because there's a plane that turns under. And then this is turning back out towards the light. This is turning away from the light. So it's really a matter of doing your light and shadow is really a matter of knowing the direction that your light is coming from. So you can determine all these little shadow areas, and we'll get into painting them in just a little bit. But knowing those planes is really what defines light and shadow for the face. And there's models that you can view 3D models and helpful to if you Google planes of the face, you're going to get a bunch of images that show like 3D models where everything's real flat and it's easy to see. On the face, everything's curved, but these models will help you to see the actual like hard edge planes, and that just helps you to visualize it. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really helps. And Nathan, would you agree that the majority of beginners and amateurs just don't bother with these steps?
Oh, for sure.
Like they should. They just skip past it and start drawing a face and wonder why it doesn't look right.
Fundamentals. Yeah, these are the absolute fundamentals. And once you know these and you have a grasp, you don't even really think about it anymore. You can just enjoy the drawing process or the painting process without thinking about well, this is a plane and this is a shadow, and that, you just kind of know these things, and you don't have to worry. So yes, spend the time to absolutely learn this stuff, because it will change your enjoyment of the process once you do.
It's a great tip.
Cool. All right, I'm gonna delete those.
So what was this? This was the colored pencils at this stage?
This is not colored pencils. This is just, I just colored the pencil lines. So I drew this in black, and then I went back over it, and using the alpha lock, I just colored the pencils. Okay, so now on my final pencil layer, now this starts to turn into a painting, but here's what I did. And I'm showing you this now because I actually do this throughout the process, but it becomes covered up and you can't really see it. But I take a smudge tool, and in this one, I think I used the smudge tool in the gouache pack.
Yep.
And as I'm painting, if I see too much pencil, I just take the smudge tool and just smudge the pencil a little bit. But even just looking at this layer, you can already see that we're starting to get a painterly-like effect just from smudging the pencils. And I think that's really cool, because you could almost do a really loose painting with just pencils and a smudge tool, which is really fun and cool. But I do this throughout the process, so I wanted to show it to you, because once we start laying paint down, it's really hard to see what's going on in this layer. So this is the layer that I'll keep. I turned off the initial sketch and the refined pencil. So this is my actual pencil layer that I'm going to keep. So from here, I added some watercolor. Now, this is just some flesh tone, a little bit light and a little bit dark. I used this brush from the watercolor set primarily. It's a textured round. Make sure I'm on the right layer. And this brush is really cool, because if you press lightly, you get this kind of wet edge effect, and you can go back over it. And in fact, I'll choose a light color so you can see it a little better. I love this brush because see how it just kind of gives you this, like, just sort of this wet edged look. I love this brush. And then it's also transparent like real watercolor. So when you paint over, you can still see the color or the mark underneath.
Well, so much of the beauty of watercoloring is layering.
Absolutely. Yeah. Watercolor, you start with a real light and you build towards dark. So I started with this light layer and I built towards dark. So that's all we're looking at there. There's not much to it, but I just began to add the flesh tone.
Super helpful. Just seeing a bit of insight into each step, because I realize in the time for this session, you can't paint the entire thing start to finish, of course. But we're just getting to understand the techniques at each stage.
So this painting would probably take me about, depending on experimenting, because, you kind of go off on an, experimental, sidetrack when you're doing some of this stuff. But if I were to paint this from start to finish, it would take me about 3 to 4 hours, which we don't have time for. So
it's still pretty impressive. I think it would take me 3 to 4 years.
So don't feel bad if you can't paint this guy in 45 minutes. This is a process that takes a good 3 to 4 hours. And then if you experiment, it might take a little longer. And I'll show you some experimentation here in just a little bit. My next layer, I added some gouache. And what I wanted to do on this layer, I wanted to leave the idea of traditional flesh tone color, or what my reference photos had for flesh tone. And I wanted to put in some wild colors, that were not, typical skin tones. I wanted, to just kind of start down the path of adding some crazy weird colors in. So all I did was I chose a warm and I chose a cool. And I just put in a little bit of warm orange in some of the highlight areas and some blue into some of the shadow areas. And I used the gouache brushes. The gouache set is very similar to watercolor, but it's a little bit more opaque. So I'll show you an example. Now this one, you can, the harder you press, the more opaque it becomes. So it's just, you can get transparency and opaque in traditional gouache, and you can here in this set as well. So it's kind of a middle ground. Gouache is a middle ground between watercolor and acrylic. So whereas acrylic,
It's so realistic. Honestly, Nathan, like if this was against the paper texture, you could have told me you just scanned in a painting you did.
Right. It really gives the feel of, oh, this is real gouache paint. This feels real to me, and that's so exciting to me because I worked really hard to achieve that, and I'm excited that when I sit down to do a painting like this, I'm like, oh yeah, here's the gouache or here's the acrylic, and it works like I intended it to. So it's really exciting to paint with. Okay, now the next layer is oil. And now, typically, you in traditional media, you wouldn't paint oil. Oil kind of stands alone because of the chemical. It's not water. It uses oil as the binder. So you wouldn't paint oil over watercolor, but I did in this case, and it's a tremendous amount of fun. So, okay, in the oil brushes, there is a huge pack of oil. And I tried to include as much like smooth, blendable paints as I could, but also as much texture as I could. So there's palette knives, and there's grain, and there's encaustic and impasto and wax and all the things that you can do with oil paint. And for this one, I think I used some of the thick wax or the encaustic knife to get some of these textures. And it just feels fantastic to paint with these brushes. It's just, there's smoothness, and then the harder you press, the more opaque it becomes. And there's just great texture. And so I chose again some warm colors and some cool colors. And right here, this was experimentation. No rhyme or reason. I'm just looking for, in this layer, what looks right to my eye, what feels kind of balanced, what feels right in the colors, but looks very not particularly realistic, just kind of loose and abstract.
I love as all the colors start coming together, though. Like you can see in the cheek, you got the reds and the blues. Like it's it just gives such a beautiful depth to it.
Yes, yeah, I really like right here. That just these colors that right here.
That's where I was looking.
Yeah, so good. And that just happens by just experimenting, just laying down some colors and kind of seeing what happens. Now, I did the same thing with sort of like his shoulder area. I needed something so his head wouldn't be floating. So I just added some more oil. Now, right here, I used a smudge tool just to kind of smudge that out in just up and down direction to get that sort of.
And is that a smudge brush from your pack, or just the kind of standard one?
These smudge tools right here, there's a knife smudge, a thumb smudge, whereas if you were to take your thumb and just in fact we'll look at it.
I was gonna say that'd be fun.
Okay, so let's take this, and what's on this layer? Let's see if we can just.
Kayla said, I've always loved this style of painting, but I've been intimidated. Be intimidated no more, Kayla. Nathan's going to break it down today. It's just step by step.
I'll show you something in just a minute that will totally take the intimidation away. So if you, on the wrong layer, if you take the smudge, it's almost like just taking your thumb and just smudging out the paint, just rubbing it into what would be the canvas or the paper. It's just so fun.
It is, and like real paint, it just gets kind of fainter and fainter the further you smudge it.
Absolutely. Yeah, the further you go, the more blended it becomes. Okay, and for the background, I added, now this is just a gray background, and on the gray background, I went back to the watercolor set, and there's a few brushes that are just purely for like a wash texture. And it's these four right here. This is Stress Cloud, Grunge Cloud, Sponge Wash, and Media Wash. And what these do is they just create this fantastic, as if the paper were partially wet, partially dry, and you were just kind of loosely painting watercolor, and you get these like crazy cloud wash textures. So that's what I did for this layer. I just layered it up from dark to light gray.
Nice.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely had some good depth.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so here's where things start to get really interesting because I start to bring in those shadows and highlights. So at this point, we've just got a pencil sketch and we've really just kind of thrown down some paint. Now, there's no rhyme or reason so much to the last couple of layers other than we just want some wild colors and some wild textures to build from. Okay, so I started adding shadows with gouache. Now I'm bringing in really dark shadowed areas. Now, typically what I do is I go back and forth between the shadows and the highlights. And again, I'm using the gouache brushes and I'm using the ones towards the top, like Broken Wet and Loaded Opaque. And what these do is it's just a really opaque, nice line that I can add and blend on top of each other. But I work with a shadow and highlight. If you can see that, see the highlights coming in. Okay.
Yeah, it's like a kind of splatter effect almost.
Yeah, I'm gonna zoom in like on the eye here so you can see what's happening. So I added highlights using the gouache detail brush along with the shadow. So I might paint the shadows of the eye and then come back and do these real light, small brush, real light highlights in his eyebrow. Same for the eye, just adding these really light highlights. Now down here, I added these textures, and I'll show you what this is. So there's a little bit of splatter and there's a little bit of grunge going on because I wanted his beard to sort of fade out, if that makes sense. And I used a brush in the gouache set. It is.
I can't believe how many brushes there are as you're going through this.
There's a lot.
This is just one out of 11, right?
I'm sorry, say again?
The gouache pack is 1 out of 11. Is that right?
Out of 12, I believe. If you
out
count
of 12,
the
sorry. Yeah,
there's 12 packs. So wow. What I was looking for at this point was his beard to just kind of like just sort of fade out into a texture. And I used this salted texture brush in the gouache pack. And watercolor and gouache in traditional media, if you while it's still wet and you add salt, just sprinkle a little bit of salt on the paper, it will sort of spider and do like crazy weird textures. And that's a technique that can be used in watercolor and gouache. And I wanted to capture that texture in one of these brushes. So it just adds this bit of grungy, gritty texture, but it's still, because I know that gouache and watercolor will do this, it still looks like gouache and watercolor to me. So I added a little bit of that just to make his beard begin to get crazy.
That's very cool.
Yeah, in this one I'm kind of doing a little bit of both, depending on because it's mixed media and there's really not some hard rules. I may go light to dark, and then suddenly I decide, well, that's not dark enough. And then I go dark again and then start bringing it toward light, which I just did just now. I would go looking at what I have at this step. I'm like, okay, well, I need to start adding some contrast is really what I'm looking for. It's just purely contrast. So I start adding these 2 layers to build up from that contrast. So at this point, I had gone from light moving towards dark. And from this point on, I'll be going dark, moving towards light.
Yep.
So once you start the process and you know what you're looking for, you may find yourself going back and forth a little bit, especially with this kind of technique, which is extremely loose and just sort of intuitive as you go. Now with traditional media, if we were just going watercolor, we'd have to go light to dark. Or if we were going maybe acrylic or oil, we may choose to go dark to light. But here, again, there's just no rules. You can kind of go back and forth from one to the other.
It's a creative playground, Nathan.
It is. And and that's part of what makes it so fun. It's just there's really no rules to adhere to. Well, like I can't do this or I can't do that. Not at all. I mean, you can add oil and then come back and use marker over it. It's just, that's what's so great about it.
Love that.
All right. So now again, I've gone to gouache, and now I'm going to go back to oil. And basically what I'm doing in this layer is I'm starting to just bring back some of those facial planes and some of those highlight areas, but I want to add to continue the texture that I've started down here in this area. I want to continue that a little bit through the face. And the way I did that in the oil set was I'm using this brush. It's, see if I can find it in here. It's Crusty Palette Knife, which is a really great brush. And it just makes this really just cool texture. And the harder you press, if you've painted with a palette knife before, you kind of know that if you drag a palette knife real lightly over a canvas, you're going to get this like really like crusty texture. But then if you press down on it, you're going to get this real thick, like if you fill the palette knife full of paint, you're going to get this really thick paint over the canvas. So palette knives are fun to paint with, and I wanted to include a lot of palette knife brushes and textures in the set. So you can see here, I've got these textures. Let me go back to a pencil so I can sort of circle some of this. Like right in here, I've got these cool textures that are created with that brush. You can see that. Oh, and then down here, the beard, right in here.
Super cool. And is that full opacity and just using the natural, opaqueness of the brush to kind of do its thing?
Just with the pressure, pressing down lightly, using light pressure on the pencil.
Yeah, so cool.
It's a very freeing process. I mean, once you've got some of these fundamentals, which we talked about in the beginning, then it's just the doors are just wide open. It's like just run with it. Do whatever you want. Throw down some crazy colors, which we're going to do some more of here in a minute. Okay, I wanted to take a side note in this next step on the airbrush, because I didn't, in the final painting, I didn't use the airbrush, but I wanted to talk about it for a second because Drew Struzan's technique relies very heavily on the airbrush, which I wanted to include it because I included an airbrush pack in this set specifically as a tribute to Drew Struzan's process. Now, typically when you look at a digital airbrush, maybe the ones that come by default with Procreate or Photoshop, they're really soft. And I have a couple of airbrushes, and I created this set by sampling actual sprays from an airbrush. And
how messy did your house get, Nathan, when you were making this pack?
Luckily, I have like a studio space.
Okay, but your studio, was there paint everywhere?
I'm sorry?
Was there paint everywhere by the end of it?
There was, yeah. There's a concrete floor in here, and it's full of paint splatters, and it's really just, it has a texture of, it's almost a painting in itself. Okay, so with these airbrushes, you get, if you can see that, there's still this grain of actual airbrush splatter. It's not real smooth and soft like a typical digital airbrush. And I included several of these packs. There's a dual action brush, standard nozzle, grainy nozzles, just all these different ways of creating these just real grainy, take the size down a little bit, just these really grainy airbrush effects. And that is so cool to me because it's like, it's a little bit of Drew Struzan's process, and which I love, and it feels like a real airbrush. If you've ever used an airbrush before, you know what I'm talking about. You'll know what a dual action is, and you'll know what standard nozzles are, and superfine, and all these sprays and splatters. It'll be familiar to you. If it's not, if you haven't used a real airbrush, you'll still find it amazing because of all the variation that you can get and all these really grainy textures. It's a lot of fun. Okay.
Nathan, one thing I love about your work,
yes,
you have a real background in traditional media. And I think it really shows, because there's a lot of people who create products and brushes and so on, and they've never done analog painting.
Sure.
And so you can tell it's a digital fake, or it's not as genuine as the real thing. But I think your experience, the fact you've got this art studio, you work with paint every single day, this shows how you can bring that in a really authentic way into the digital realm.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly what I've tried to capture, especially in this brush set. But in all my work, really, I try to make things look and feel not just in the end result, but in the process for me. I want, if I'm using digital watercolor, I want it to act and feel like real watercolor. I don't want it to be a brush that's labeled watercolor but doesn't really look or behave anything like real watercolor.
Exactly.
So I go to great lengths to try and capture that feeling. Okay, so side note on the airbrush, but I'm going to turn that layer off because I didn't use it in the final painting. But I did go down a little experimental stage with the airbrush to see if it would work, and that's what created that little side note there. So the next step was I used acrylic for some highlights, especially in the hair. Like I wanted to start bringing his hair out, and if you can see the differences there, I used a smooth brush. Now the acrylic set, there's a lot of brushes in the acrylic set. It might be the biggest one, and the reason I did that was because, in my opinion, acrylic is the most versatile paint medium. Now, I'm sure there would be some folks that would argue this, but it's the most versatile because acrylic, when it can look like oil, it can be watered down and it can look like gouache, or acrylic, it can be watered down, it can be sprayed through an airbrush, it can be mixed down, and it can be used as an ink for a dip pen. So acrylic is very, very versatile, and you can also make lots of amazing textures. And I'm just going to scroll through the acrylic brush real quick, the brush set real quick, just so you can see all the different. I mean, we go from these smooth opaque brushes up here down to like some thin glazes here, and then down to some really crazy textures and some wild strokes and sponge and watered down and modeling paste, some palette knives, all kinds of mixers, and then several smudgers and erasers. Now, that's a lot. No.
So cool. This is like a whole art studio in your
It
pocket.
is like an art studio, very much so. It's like having all the tools of an art studio. In fact, there were stages in this brush creation where I just laid everything out on a table, and I was like, okay, what does this tool do, and how can I capture it in a digital brush? You know, like palette knives or sponges, for example. You know, what do they do, and what do they look like, and what can you create with that sort of tool? So in this stage, I used some of these more opaque brushes to get. Let's take a look at the highlights in his hair. Some of these brushes to get the highlights in his hair, just doing some strokes in the direction. Now there was a question about hair, but it didn't really rate high in the poll, but I'm going to cover it anyway. So when you're doing hair, let's take a quick look here. Let's go on this layer. Now, I think in my original sketch, I probably had some of the direction, but a real quick and easy way to do hair is if you were to draw the shape of his hair, especially when you're gonna paint it, because you know that you're gonna need to block in some kind of color for the hair. Like there's the actual shape of his hair, right? Now, I've obviously gone outside the lines because I do that. And you
because you're a creative maverick, that's why.
I won't stay inside the lines.
You can't constrain me.
I just drew these lines. Now go outside them. No, but and then when you start to bring in the highlights, you can leave some of those. Like if you were to darken in these shapes with a dark base color to give the general shape of his hair, then you might use light tones to get some of these directional, just these lumps of hair. Don't try to go in and draw like individual like hairs. You know, don't do that unless you're going for some high level detailed illustration. But typically you wouldn't do that. You would just capture the highlights and the lowlights of the hair working within these shapes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely broad strokes at this point, and you're still building up the portrait with each layer.
Right. Okay, now, this is where things begin to get detailed. And now going back to Drew Struzan, using colored pencil over paint was just a mind-blowing thing for me. I mean, it opened up a world that I had no idea existed beforehand. But I began taking colored pencils over acrylic paint and watercolor, and just detailing. The level of detail that you can get is just it's incredible, and it takes mixed media, in my opinion, to a new level. So I work the shadow layer and the highlight layer, usually going back between the two, going back and forth between the two. But I would add low lights, like for example, let's zoom in here. And I'll show you the colored pencil as well. It's in the brush set. There's actually 3 colored pencils. There's colored pencil, there's colored soft, and there's colored fine. And for this, I just use the colored pencil. And it's similar to the pencil brushes, but it's a little bit thicker and it's a little bit more waxy looking, like a colored pencil would be. It's just got a thicker stroke. Whoops. Okay. So I'm taking some of these. Let's make sure we're on. Okay, that's cool. Just adding some texture to his beard, some of these squiggly lines, just because I wanted to get those beard hairs. Just some detail, just some shadow area in here. I'm just going in with the pencil and adding some lines, getting these lines in the beard. I turned it off again. Adding some of these shadow areas. Some of these, bring out some of these hairs, bring out some of the hair here. These are just colored pencil lines. Okay, but it really gets serious up here in the eye. Let me turn the highlight one off so you can see. Oh, the highlight one is off. Okay. So right here, you can see it bringing out the details in the eye. And the shadowed details. Okay, and then the highlight layer is the same. So in the highlight layer, I'm taking some of these areas, like this area here. I'm doing some cross hatching to just lightly bring some of the light within the shadow out.
And are you using the eyedropper to kind of sample colors that are already in there?
At this point, I'm sampling some colors from just around in areas and then choosing a lighter color. Like say to bring out the shadow a little bit, I may sample that color and then just make it a little bit lighter to get that pencil color.
Yeah, just a subtle shift. Would you mind doing a super quick demo of cross hatching for anyone that might not be familiar?
Absolutely.
I love cross hatching. I did so much at school.
This is one of those. I'm not going to say that you do it real fast, and I'm not going to say that you do it real slow. It's really just what's comfortable to you. Let me get a lighter one so you can see it. Sometimes it helps to define a shape. You might do that sometime before you begin, or if you know, just getting these lines.
So cool. We got a few people saying it looks like Sean Connery with the eyebrow.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's cool. Unintentional, but really cool. Yeah, so you can see in some different areas where I just cross hatch lightly. I'm not going crazy with the colors. I'm just subtly bringing out different areas. You can see it up here as well. And then you can see up here in the hair. Let me turn it off so you can see the difference in the hair again. So really adding some little crazy squiggly hairs. And
it adds a lot, though. It adds a lot for the realism of it. I always notice that when artists start adding some of those finer details, it kind of brings a piece to life.
Right. Yeah, it really does begin. You go from here suddenly to there. So it really adds a lot, and it's just detailing. It's going in and zooming in on areas and really bringing out some detail. And it's my favorite step because you put the music in your ears, you put the headphones on, and you just go and you start doing all this detailing, and time kind of slips away, and then you come back, you zoom out, and it's like, oh wow, and then you go back in another area and start detailing that. It's really it's the most fun. But the point is, though, in this step, we went from these big broad strokes of just throwing down and splashing color, and we were drilling down towards this detail and bringing out the detail at this stage. So we go from really broad big to really fine small. Now, another favorite step of mine. Now, Drew Struzan would use splatters, and somehow it just magically brings out a level of rendering that doesn't really exist, but it's somehow your eye perceives it as existing. and it's just through fine splatters. Okay, so this layer is just dark splatters. And what I've done is I've taken the splatters from the watercolor set. There's 3 or 4 splatter brushes. There's single drips, there's tiny splatters, there's large splatters, alcohol drops, sprinkled salt, and rough salt. These are all variations of a splatter effect. For this one, I think I varied between large splatter and tiny splatter. So what it does is it sort of begins this process of rendering, and all I'm doing is just splattering. Okay, if you can see the difference from there to there, it just suddenly starts to look more detailed and rendered, even though it's just splattered paint. Drew Struzan would do this with sometimes a toothbrush and ink or black acrylic, and would just go over the whole painting and just splatter just all over.
Well, you know what it's similar to, Nathan? We work with a lot of texture artists, and it's like when people drop a great texture over a piece of work, it pulls everything together, right? It unifies it visually.
Absolutely. Yeah. For sure. It just somehow it just begins to unify the whole. That's a really good word for it. It just begins to bring unity to the whole piece. And I did 2 layers of this. I did a dark splatter and I did a light splatter. And somehow that just begins to add highlights that weren't there before. And it's hard to explain, but when you see it, it's like, I wouldn't have thought to just splatter paint.
It really, really works.
Okay, so on this next layer, we're doing something that is purely digital, that is just like purely something that you can do with ease. On the digital side, that would be really hard or next to impossible for a traditional painting, and that is to add some lighting effects. Now, what I did for this layer was I used just various watercolor textures, and I just painted in these lighted areas. Now let's take a look at the layer itself. It's the opacity is set to 75, and the blend mode is set to overlay. Now let's see if we can go to normal here. See, that's what the normal paint looks like. It's using those watercolor wash brushes that I showed you before. I'm taking yellow for the warm side and blue for the cool side of his face, and just painted all over it and set it to overlay, and it creates this beautiful lighted sort of effect that would be really hard to do at this stage in the game, would be really hard to do traditional. But with digital, it's just, a few seconds and you can add some cool lighting effects. As simple as that.
I hate to use the word because I'm going to sound like a bad client, but it really makes it pop. And and to be honest, Nathan, I don't know if you're familiar. I know you're from the drawing and painting side. I used to really live in the photo manipulation world, and this is such a common Photoshop technique where you get a really soft, large brush with a bright color and then set it to overlay mode, and it just brings the whole piece to life.
Right. I can't believe you just said pop.
Don't judge me.
It makes it pop. That's exactly what I was about to say. No, it's just a cool effect, and I always, at this towards the end stage, I begin to look forward to this, thinking, okay, I'm about to add the overlay layer. Let's see what it's going to look like. And it's always exciting to, especially experiment with this sort of effect. And I really do. You're absolutely right. It makes it pop. Okay, I also wanted to talk about, because we're getting close to finalizing this painting, but I wanted to talk for just a second about experimenting, because you can go from, I said this might take 3 to 4 hours. You can take this painting down the 8 to 12 hour route if you really want to experiment. And the reason I say that is because let's just take a light color, and I'm on a layer above everything else, and let's go back to that gouache salt again. Okay, so now you can just start adding stuff, and that, I'm not mad at that, right? I mean, you can just start doing things, and it can possibly work if you just keep. Now I might have to go back with colored pencil again and bring back some detail, but I'm still okay with that. I could add that. So you have to hit a point where you say, okay, I'm done. But really, especially if you leave this in a layered state and you walk away from it for a day and you come back, a few days later and you look at it and you're going to say, oh, well, I could add this and I could add that and I could experiment with this, just like I just did with this salted gouache brush. I could come in and maybe add a little salt to the cool side, maybe do that and maybe do this, and you can really just continue on with this thing. So you have to be okay with calling it done at some point in time.
You do. Nathan, do you mind if I take a 30-second break to just shout out your Instagram for a second?
Sure.
So go and follow Nathan on Instagram. His work is unbelievable. And this is a really fun game because hopefully every time we're kind of refreshing Instagram now, there's going to be more people following. Which
would be super fun to see. Bananas over here. It's really going nuts.
Good. Yeah, if you're getting value from this session, go drop a follow, because Nathan just puts up beautiful work, regularly on Instagram. So it's going to make your feed look that much more beautiful.
Oh, cool. Thank you so much. I appreciate the follows and the support and the kind words. I'm always amazed at people saying nice things. Okay, now in this final step, I'm hopefully going to blow your minds one more time, because it certainly blows my mind every time I do this. But you have to, I'm going to flatten the whole painting, okay? But you have to do it in a certain way so that you don't lose your color effects. You can't flatten an overlay layer onto other layers until the whole painting is completely flat. So I'm going to pinch these layers down and flatten this whole thing. And then I'm going to add that overlay layer to flatten that. And we should be flat. Okay. Now, we don't actually need that. I'm going to duplicate this so we can see the difference here in a sec. Okay. I am going to do a color adjustment with the color balance. It's up here under the magic wand, color balance. And then if you're using the latest version of Procreate, you'll want to select layer, because we're going to apply this to the whole thing. Okay. So now we have some sliders down here at the bottom, and I'm going to start with the midtones, and I'm going to begin to just play with the colors to just get some different looks to the painting. I'm going to go a little bit warmer there, maybe a little bit cooler there. I'm going to switch over to, let's go shadows.
Again, I feel like this, much like the texturing and the splatters, really helps unify it.
It certainly does. I'm going to go a little warmer with the shadows.
Nathan, I was going to talk to you privately afterwards, but just saying, I'm about to move house and set up a home studio. And I don't know if you've ever considered releasing any of these for prints, because I'd love to have this on my wall.
Sure. Yeah, I'm actually, this painting is like 13 by 16, so you could make a good size print.
Incredible.
Real high quality print. Okay, on the highlights, I'm going to maybe go towards warm again, maybe. I'm just making these fine adjustments. Maybe go a little warm towards. Let's go back and look at midtones again, and maybe go a little bit bluer with the midtones. I don't know. See what I mean? You can keep experimenting with this. I mean, you can just go nuts. I think I'm going to keep it towards warm, because I like what's going on up top where his hair is. That orange is really coming out. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave it there. You can continue to experiment with it, but I think I'm going to leave it right there. And
so impressive. That was amazing. Nathan is one of the most beloved product creators and designers in our marketplace, for good reason. Thank you for being, I'm giving you all the feels now, Nathan, but truly, we love working with you, and thank you for being awesome.
Thank you so much. Really, I can't say it enough.
Amazing. Well, I will chat to you very soon, partly so I can try and get that awesome print on the wall of my new home office, hopefully. But yeah, we'll catch you really soon. And thanks again for everything.
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for showing up. I really appreciate it. And all the kind words and the followers, really so good. Thank you all so much.
See you later, man. Take care.
Bye.